Is the screen visible?
Yes, very clear. Yes, you can start now, Ish.
Great, thank you. Hello, colleagues. So my name is Aishwarya, and I will be leading today's capacity building session for environmental law series. So I will be briefing in two conventions. One is CITES and the other one is CMS. So let me start off with CITES. The CITES is the Convention on International Trade of Flora and Fauna, and it was adopted in the year 1963 by members of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. Like the name suggests, the main objective of this instrument is to address the international trade of only certain species that is included in that convention. Certain species of flora and fauna that is listed by the member parties under this convention. It is one of the oldest conventions on sustainability and conservation, and it is also one of the conventions to have the largest membership of nations. Currently, it has 183 members as parties to this convention. So this convention was, although it was adopted in the year 1963, it came into effect from 1st July 1935. So why was this convention introduced? The main aim of this convention was to make sure that any international trade that takes place of either flora or fauna does not harm their existence in numbers in nature. So this is a legally binding treaty, which means that members are legally obligated to follow the things that they agree to under this convention, else barring which they will be sanctioned. And sanctions can be placed on the members if these obligations are not followed. So since the development of international trade in history, international wildlife trade has also grown very dramatically. And this includes both legal and illegal trade. So the industry is worth billions of dollars, but the harm comes where it started to affect the very existence of flora and fauna that it dealt with. There were a lot of species that were becoming endangered, and some species were also becoming extinct due to the rampant trade that happened uh, on an international scale. So to counteract this endangerment or extinction is why this CITES convention was brought into effect. So currently, this convention regulates the international trade of around 36,000 species. It has taken, the convention in itself has taken many steps in order to counteract wildlife trade. One of these important steps is establishing the International Consortium of Combating Wildlife Crime, or the ICCWC. It is a collaborative effort of CITES along with a lot of other organizations like the Interpol and the UN Office of Drugs and Crimes. So, how is this convention structured and how does it actually tackle wildlife trade? So, this convention has three appendices, which is where flora and fauna are categorized based on the threat level of extinction. Appendix 1 contains all the species that have the highest level of threat for extinction. Uh, a few examples can be red panda or the Asian elephant. So the convention also classifies the nature of trade that takes place amongst the parties internationally. This can be either commercial in nature or non-commercial in nature. This species of flora and fauna that is indicated under Appendix 1 of this convention by the member countries cannot be traded in a commercial nature. A total ban is imposed on the trading of commercial nature, but trading of these animals in a non-commercial sense is still allowed, only that it requires certain licenses for it to happen. Appendix 2 deals with species that are not necessarily threatened with extinction, but if these species are protected, it would help them for their survival. So here, both types of trade, that is commercial and non-commercial, is permitted, but there are certain approvals and certificates that need to be obtained under as given under CITES in order for this trade to happen. This species under Appendix 2 contains the most number of species of flora and fauna, and certain common examples can be stony corals or white sharks, or even the emperor scorpion. So Appendix 3 is the appendix that contains the least number of flora and fauna, and this is specifically nominated by a member country. There are certain conditions for a flora and fauna to be listed in Appendix 3. One is that it has to be protected at least in one country, and two, that particular member country should request for protection for curbing the trade of such flora and fauna in order to make sure that they are protected and they don't become extinct. So certain examples of this can be the two-toed sloth, which was included in Appendix 3 after it was recommended by Costa Rica, and the African seaway, which was included in Appendix 3 after it was recommended by Botswana. So I will move on to how the entire site system is structured. The implementation of sites is dependent on national actors or systems that are placed in every member country of this convention. It has a three-pronged system, which is basically scientific authority, management authority, and enforcement authority. So what the scientific authority does is that it determines the appropriate level of trade. In the sense, which level can this flora or fauna be traded on in a way that it doesn't affect the endangerment or extinction? In which level can we trade to these species, but still make sure that they are safe in number and adequate in number in their habitat is what the scientific authority determines. The management authority, in turn, makes sure that there is adequate traceability of legal documents with respect to any and every trade that is happening in all the species of flora and fauna that is mentioned in all of the appendixes in this convention. The enforcement authority, as the name suggests, is its main duty is to fight against illegal trade, and it makes sure that none of the provisions of this convention is violated by the parties. So, in order for trade to happen under this convention, there are three conditions. One is that the trade should not be detrimental to the survival of that particular species, in the sense that the population should not deteriorate beyond a certain number that will bring the species into the category of endangered or extinct. Two, the species is not obtained by violating certain laws of that country. So a lot of uh, countries have domestic laws which protect certain species that that particular country considers as endangered or in need of conservation. So there are lots of domestic laws that are implemented by those countries to make sure that these particular species are protected in specific. So this convention covers all of these domestic conservation laws and says that these any species of flora and fauna that are obtained should not be obtained by violating such specific domestic conservation laws. Third, any transport of this flora and fauna that is made should minimize the damage or risk of injury or even death of such species when it is made when it is being made for such transactions. So there are certain exceptions to these rules. For example, pre-convention species. So pre-convention species refers to specimens that were acquired before the species of flora and fauna were added to the appendixes of this convention. For example, if a red panda is one of the species that is extremely endangered and is reflected in Appendix 1 of this convention. But any species of red panda that was acquired before red panda was reflected in Appendix 1 of this convention will fall outside the scope of this convention. But in this case, there is still something called a pre-certificate that is required, which ensures that this species is actually legally acquired, and it is acquired before the inclusion of such species in Appendix 1 to make sure that the provisions of this convention will not apply. Second is the household effect. This excludes all the animals that are house pets um under this convention. So, but this does not apply where the domestic laws choose to be stricter. If the domestic laws choose to be stricter in terms of trading of house pets, then the convention itself will take a higher category. The third one is captively bred or artificially bred animals. So when species of flora and fauna are artificially bred or bred in captivity, if they fall under Appendix 1, which means that they fall under the highest level of threat, they can still be commercially traded as an appendix to flora fauna. Non-commercial trade in this sense is handled by the management authority, which is one of the national mechanisms mentioned before as to how the site functions. So this convention is a pretty straightforward and very strong convention in a very theoretical sense. In theory, this convention is legally binding. If parties violate the obligations under this convention, a sanction can be imposed on the members. And even the rules and the obligations that are structured under this convention are pretty stronghold and hold the members up to a very higher standard. But there are still problems that lie in this convention, and these problems mostly stem from its implementation. The first major problem is that the sanctions that are imposed under this convention mainly stem from the members and not the secretariat, which means if a sanction has to be imposed on a member for any violation of obligation, say any member is undertaking illegal trade of a species, then this has to be imposed by the member states coming together and imposing a sanction on the member that is not following the obligation. This makes countries very hesitant to impose sanctions because, in a very informal sense, a lot of countries are involved in violations of the obligations that are mentioned under uh, this convention. So, for practical examples, one of the example of a successful sanction that was imposed was on Thailand for ivory trading. So most of the ivory trading in Thailand decreased after sanctions were imposed by the member states. But there are also a lot of instances where imposing sanctions doesn't actually have an effect on this illegal trading that is happening in the state. And one of such examples is Laos. So even though all the member countries came forward to impose sanctions on Laos, there was not exactly a very major change that happened after such sanctions were imposed. So, although theoretically all the countries came together in order to condemn the illegal trading of flora and fauna that is happening in Laos, it didn't have a much practical effect on the tangent of the trade that was happening internationally. So another main problem that exists with this with respect to this system is the rampant corruption. So in very local levels, in order to trade species, whether legally or illegally, there are a lot of authorities who commonly accept bribes in order to give any of the certificates or approvals that are necessary uh, for trading of such flora and fauna. And since such corruption is extremely rampant, there are a lot of loopholes that are practically created under this convention to make sure that species end up being traded legally or illegally. The third major problem is with respect to data reporting by member countries. So, in the conference of parties that usually takes place under this convention, member countries are required to report the import and export of endangered flora and fauna uh, of the species that are listed under this convention. But one of the main problems that was observed through the conference of parties is that the member states are not exactly accurate in the numbers that they report. Even though the numbers of export may be accurate, the numbers that are reflected by the countries with respect to the import of such exotic items or exotic species is not being reflected properly. So what happened in the latest COP with respect to this convention? The latest COP was COP 19, which was held in Panama in the year 2022. And in this convention, 46 proposals to amend the CITES were adopted. So the major agreements that takes place in the conference of parties with relation to CITES is the amendment of the appendixes itself in order to move species from one appendix to the other or include species that have not been included before into the appendixes itself. So there were two major amendments that were brought in all of the previous COPs till now. One is the bond amendment. This allowed for the Secretariat of the CITES to deal with financial and budgetary issues with respect to all the actions that are undertaken by the Secretariat of the CITES. The second major amendment is the Gaborone Amendment. This allowed for member countries to be represented as a group itself. This includes regional groups or economic groups that may come together, like the European Union or the GRULAC. So this COP19 also discussed uh, a lot of obligations in relation to uh, the species that are reflected in Appendix 1, 2, and 3. The most notable proposals are the one made by the European Union, which address species exploited for pet trade or overfish species or tropical timber with respect to flora. So another important aspect that was discussed here is the definition of the word zoonosis, which basically refers to infectious diseases that may be transmitted from animals to humans or humans to animals. In order to address one of the biggest loopholes of CITES, which is the rampant corruption, this COP addressed in detail the corruption mitigation policies that may be brought about in order to uh, bring down the existing levels of corruption both in the local and the global level with respect to wildlife trading. And another common area that was discussed in the COP was wildlife trading and management to make sure that the officials that are involved in wildlife trading know how to handle the flora and fauna during the entire process.